about education, but to create it and to be part of it. That's incredibly empowering. And having done that once, parents are ready and others are ready to do that again.
Other thoughts by folks on why now? And just to, and Kelly made the point, like, it's having a moment, right? Is it a moment, or will it be a period, right? Or an era? Like, will it persist, I guess, is maybe part of also embedded in that question a little bit. Joe?
Yeah, from our point of view, where we work more with policies and with states, I think that it's important to note, as Kelly said, that a lot of these changes were happening with parents prior to the pandemic. The pandemic, like it did to a lot of industries, accelerated changes in K through 12. And what I often say is that policy is a lagging indicator. So parents have been doing this for 5, 4, 3 years in some cases. And I think what you're beginning to see now with so many microgrant and ESA programs passing nationwide, that policymakers, governors, lawmakers are beginning to catch up that that's something that parents want. And accordingly, they now need to look at, hey, how do we fund K through 12? And so they're looking at alternative mechanisms for doing it, which I think is why ESAs and microgrants are so popular. And I think that unlike a lot of other education reforms, and I've worked in the charter school sector and others, this really is a moment that would not be possible except for parents, because when these programs they pass usually overwhelmingly, they're now universal, and there's a lot of support for them kind of across the spectrum.
Adam, if I may, I think one of the differences right now is that if you look at families and you consider what their deeply held values are, they are emboldened in this moment to convert those deeply held values into expectations for change. And that's true whether a family has their child in a traditional school or if they are opting to educate their child in an unconventional setting. In either case, we're seeing family voice elevated because they're demanding change. And when we ask, what is the change that you want? What are those values that you care deeply about? We see 3 themes that emerge pretty consistently. And so it's things like, number 1, I want my child to be valued, respected, and known. I want my child to be loved in their educational setting. So it's not enough that they just go there and are dropped off at the beginning of the day and come home. They want their child to be respected and valued. So that's first. The second thing is they want their child to receive an education that's just right for them. They don't want them to be just another number, right? Treated like everybody else. And then third, they want their child to have some kind of a pathway to purpose in their life. What is this all for? And so if families are not seeing those 3 things in their child's educational setting, then they're going to argue and motivate for change, or they're going to try an alternative that's outside of their child's current environment.
Lakisha, if you think about the issues that Oakland Reach has been focused on from an advocacy perspective, how have they changed over the last several years? Have they, as a result?
Yeah, I mean, we're a totally different organization now. Before the pandemic, we were a policy and advocacy org. We had 2 big policy wins. And then actually right before the pandemic hit, our parents, literally we asked our parents what was keeping them up at night about their kids' education. And they overwhelmingly came back with literacy. They came back with reading. That launched the campaign. That launched us to actually get the district to unanimously sign an MOU to move to the science of reading, and then the pandemic hit. And we were sort of in a space like what we're gonna do. That's when we actually created like a micro school on accident. And it was that moment where everything was shut down. And we were like, we can use this, we can take all of our policy and advocacy work and use this as a way to create. I was feeling a bit disenchanted with the system. We had gotten these wins, but nothing was really changing, if I had to be honest with you. So it was kind of like, well, how do we take everything we've learned? Now we've gotten really close to this literacy work. Like, we know so much about it. We've educated our parents. We've educated our parents so much that they were trying to go back to school and fill gaps around literacy that they had. And we said, how do we use this to build a model to show the system how the hell we want to be educated, right? And we built that, so we called it a virtual hub. And I want to note that, like, it's an interesting juxtaposition because our families did not want to be in person. So I want to be very clear on that. Like, 70, 80% of our parents, so the pandemic pod stuff, all that stuff, that was no interest to our families. They were very, very afraid of the health conditions of the pandemic. Our families are primarily African American and Latino, so the virtual hub, that was huge. After we got rid of all of the infrastructure barriers, less than 50% of our families' households had internet access. They had iPads at home, they didn't have computers. We got rid of all of that. We took care of all that. Then we had the innovative model, which was the hub. That hub, in the first phase, 60% of our K-2 students went up 2 or more reading levels. This was in the middle of the pandemic. 30% went up 3 or more reading levels. And we turned around and said, oh, hell, we are on to something, right? So that was our version of educating our kids. That ended up evolving. So we ran our virtual hub for about two years. What I think it's important to note, and I think that what Meredith says makes a ton of sense, is that there are many, many more families who are choosing to keep their kids in traditional public schools, right? So we would have taken the hub and we would have kept going, but our families went back to school, right? And when our families went back to school, we had to innovate and we had to evolve. One of the key components of what we built in the virtual hub was we actually had paraprofessionals, literacy tutors who worked in the district and charter schools as teachers in our hub. Those were the folks who got the reading results. So all of a sudden we're stepping back and we're like, wait a minute, you don't need a credentialed teacher to teach kids how to read, to fill reading gaps. Could we actually teach our own community members to be this? So we took this outside model, which was the virtual hub, and then we evolved it into a model that we now integrate into the school district where we upskill parents and caregivers to be literacy tutors, right? And we're actually about to launch math. So that is kind of how we've evolved over the past 7 years and built a model outside the system that got a lot of results, but then had to step back and say, all of our families are going back. And by the way, the most vulnerable kids, I'm talking about your foster kids, all of that, they're in our traditional public schools. They're not choosing. So we have to have models inside of the system that serve those kids. And that actually helped us scale and create impact. We probably impacted 500 or 600 kids through the hub, but through our model now, we're at 6,000.
So there's an incredible diversity here. Katelyn is someone who looks at businesses, organizations, and looks to understand their impact, right? We talked about impact and quality, and we're obviously talking about, as I'm sure Meredith will tell us a little bit about, the size and scale of these unconventional learning environments are very different than our traditional school ones. How do you maybe start us off, how do you think about impact and measuring that and, measures of excellence relative to some of these models and opportunities?
Yeah, well, I think one of the important enablers of this ecosystem, and it gets to your why now, is that technology is a huge enabler of it, and it allows for much more seamless admin and back office and enabling of educators to do things that are more systematized. And so the use of the tech systems allow for teachers and educators and tutors to be upskilled and spend more time with students, but they also allow for automated data collection and measures of quality and measuring that quality continuously through ongoing formative assessments instead of just summative assessments at the end. And so I think that technology can provide a huge role in ongoing quality measures and not just one-off tests once a year.
Yeah. Kelly, as someone who's sort of seeding Microschools through your program, how do you think about quality and impact across the network?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think ultimately in the question of quality in education is an embedded question that you're not asking, which is, why do we do education? Like, what is the goal? You can't really have a quality metric without the goal. And interestingly, if you ask people, you're going to get different answers to that question. Part of what we're doing is saying, let's open it up a little bit, right? I think it's okay that people have different answers to those questions. So talking to Lakisha, it's super interesting. You heard your parents loud and clear say, we want our kids to be able to read. That's the goal. Like, that's parents saying, I want my kids to have reading proficiency. There's a way to measure that. And most parents, despite some of the things you might read on the internet about microschools, most parents actually want their kids to do English and math and learn the basics of school, right? So you put that together, we've built that in. But I think what's interesting is if you listen a little closer, you'll hear these other things, right? And so that connection, that safety. One of the girls in my first microschool, it was not my first microschool, it was my second microschool. One of my daughter's friends, and she was really struggling with math, had all these like mental blocks around it. And I remember wanting to help her get to math, but in the process, it was like almost this like diagnosis like process where we were figuring out what was going on in her brain that was preventing her from taking the risks to be wrong. Like she really didn't want to be wrong, for example. And you guys have seen this in education. Anyway, we get to the end. We sort of break through this one particular topic. She masters the thing. She gets caught up. It's a great math story. The next week, I'm at her softball game because they played softball together, my daughter and this girl. And I see her get up to the plate, and she hasn't swung all year. She's been like really timid, afraid of getting out, right? Like just will stand there and either walk or strike out every time. This girl like swings the bat the first time, and I'm thinking, there's a connection here. So you actually talk about these outcomes that we can measure, and I think it's important that we do that. But there's something bigger here, right? Which is people. And I hear Meredith talk about this all the time, right? We're talking about human beings in their quest to be what they're going to be. I think it's really important to save room for that in the discussions around quality.
Meredith, across the grantees that you have supported at VELA, like how do you organizationally think about quality and impact, and what do you try to introduce to those folks in that conversation, or what have you seen from them that has been particularly exciting and enlightening?
Yeah, so great question, Adam. And importantly, for VELA, we believe very strongly in trust-based funding, meaning we don't believe that we should substitute the values and priorities that we have as funders for the values and priorities of the entrepreneurs who are delivering unconventional education. In fact, we think that it would be wrong to do that. And so, so this is important, right? We do ask, we want to learn alongside members of our grant community. There are a bunch here. I'd love for you to raise your hands. Oh yeah, some VELA members. And but we do ask, how do you assess quality? What does success mean to you? How do you evaluate it? What is your evidence of success? And that can mean many different things to many different entrepreneurs and to the families that they serve. And so it's important to note that if someone chooses an unconventional alternative outside of a traditional school, they're doing so not because that alternative is better at delivering traditional school in an alternative environment. It's that alternative is delivering something different, okay? But that thing that is different is better for the family. And so oftentimes we hear, and again, this is anecdotal, we hear, my child wasn't getting the rigor that I expected out of the traditional school, and they're getting more rigor now, okay? Or my child wasn't getting the love that they needed, or they're not able to make decisions for themselves when they're in a traditional setting, and I want an environment that's going to build resilience and independence in my child. So those are the things that we hear, but definitely, quality. I'll just leave you with this. In most of these settings, and feel free to, we just produced a research study. It's called Open for Business, and we learned a lot. This is a study of about 413 operators and how they fund their operations. The large majority of small operators do not receive any meaningful government support or philanthropic support. They're almost entirely funded by fees that are or contributed services from families. And so, and keep in mind, this audience is largely, the audience of families is middle income and low income families. So they are sacrificing their time and their treasure to educate their children in a different way. If they were getting something of poor quality, how long do you think they would continue to make those sacrifices? So they're seeing a much, much improved quality for them and what they want out of education for their children.
Joe, let me throw sort of a related follow-up to you, but open it up to everybody, but start with you from a policy perspective, right? Like, this is pretty dramatically different for policymakers as a model than what they're accustomed to. And so when we are talking about dollars and you're facilitating dollars moving down into these communities, I'm curious, what are you hearing? How are folks grappling with these impact and quality measures at the policy level, especially given the urgency and enthusiasm of this sort of bottoms-up element that is driving this?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I like to say that we're in the first inning when it comes to ESAs and microgrants, and we're still figuring it out. So I think a lot of states are trying different options in terms of accountability and quality. One thing that we're implementing at Odyssey and rolling out in the next few months is essentially being able to allow parents who have purchased services, either goods or services, to actually rate and review. And so I think that there is an element of allowing parents to kind of share that information, because what we saw informally was that in many places where there's ESAs and microgrants, parents do share information, but it's in kind of closed communities. And so in almost every state, Arizona, Kansas, New York, there are these kind of very powerful parent groups. They exist on WhatsApp or Facebook, different things like that. And a lot of, I think, kind of common wisdom is shared there. And one thing that we're trying to do is kind of really take that and share it with the larger community. But I think similar to Meredith's point, at Odyssey, we really want to empower the parents directly and not necessarily take a top-down approach to what we think is quality. And so we think one of the best ways to do that is to allow the parents themselves to be able to rate and review services.
Yeah. I want to pick up the issue of scale. You know, outside this room, there, and probably inside this room maybe too, there are a whole bunch of investors. Katelyn's here with us, right? And Meredith as well. But there are a bunch of conventional investors who have very defined definitions of scale, which is let's get to as many people as quickly as possible and capture as much of the available, right? Lakisha, you talked about going from 500 students in the virtual hub to 5,000 with the model. You have a definition of scale for your community that's different than maybe how Katelyn is thinking about it. I'm curious, how do you all think about scale and what's appropriate in the same way we talked about quality and impact relative to this initiative? And so, Lakisha, maybe if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting question. It reminds me of an issue we just discovered about a week ago. I mean, I think you need to scale at the level that you have the capacity and you've created the rigor and results to do so. So when I talk about the Liberator model that we've built that upskills parents and caregivers to be tutors, that's great. But then we just found out that the district who we partner with, they don't have a good internal data system to actually track how much tutoring sessions that the kids are getting. So that's fun. And so our ability to even scale to more students in the district, we need to actually rectify that. We're not doing this for a good time. We want to actually be able to show how the high dosage tutoring is creating results, and we had no idea until we started asking for data as part of our research project that they didn't have this data system. They've been talking about they needed a data system, but they did not have one. And remember, we're a parent group, and I think we are sort of the epitome of parent power. And that means we have to do a lot of advocacy inside of our partnership work as well. And so now our next steps are to push to get a data system, a tracking system. So that impacts scale. Our ability to scale, we'll put some boundaries on how we'll scale based on those conditions. So I would say that we don't want to scale just to say we have these number of students in this. We want to be able for us to track that these tutors are able to move these kids along their trajectory and their reading proficiency. And without a robust data tracking system, how much inputs of tutoring they're getting in time, there's just no way that's going to happen. So we're going to be halting some brakes a little bit this summer and getting that in place.
Yeah. Katelyn, I don't know if you want to jump in on this one.
Well, I was just thinking that's where technology comes in to provide that data system to help individuals and people scale. And the way we think about scale is, I think that this is an infinite potential opportunity, and we believe that decentralized systems or solo schools, micro schools can just be enabled by technology to expand to their maximum capacity, but it's great to stay small too. We believe that everyone is an entrepreneur or they'll have to think like one, and so the more micro schools and diversity enabled to be small and stay small is fantastic. Yeah. And that is scale at the very end.
Yeah. Meredith, you have we talked beforehand, you have some interesting perspectives on scale.
Sure thing. So I think oftentimes when we think about scale, we think about single point scale. So how do you take an idea, a technology, a product, a service, and go from 1 or 2 users to having thousands, tens of thousands, or millions of users. That's how we generally use the word scale. I would invite you to consider a different kind of scale, which is more of a collective scaling. And that's through collaboration, through replication, through imitation, and the like. And so when we look at unconventional education and where it is in the evolution as a market today, what we see is that it's very much a craft industry, meaning there's thousands and tens of thousands even of entrepreneurs who are out there delivering very local, very relationship-based services, education services in their hometown. They have 10 students, 15 students, 30 students, right? And so while each one of them is not scaling to reach tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of kids, if you have 10,000 of these entrepreneurs and they're each doubling or tripling the number of students served, this has a major impact. So consider it like this. Sometimes we try to think of analogies. So when I was a kid growing up in the 70s and 80s, sorry guys, I'm pretty old, there were very few coffee shops. Does anyone remember that? Like, if you would make coffee in your house, right? Or you would go to a convenience store, right? 7-Eleven, and get your coffee. And it wasn't fancy. It was just like a commodity. It was a staple, right? And then something happened, and we started to see this growth of independent coffee shops. And then you see Starbucks, right? And they slay the market. So today we have single point scale. You have Starbucks all over the place on every corner, but you also have coffee shops all over the place. And as a society, we are spending a hell of a lot more on coffee and custom drinks than we ever did, 30 or 40 years ago. Similarly, in unconventional education, we surely could have a Prenda location on every single corner in the country, but we could also have tens of thousands of other boutique variants that are happening. So I would just like you to consider that these things can happen and be cooperative and collaborative with one another. And then the inputs that go in certainly can scale, right? Just like you can scale coffee bean production, regardless of where its ultimate destination would lie. So as we're thinking about like content and products and alternate transcript vehicles, payment processing systems, like all the infrastructure, that very much can scale. But the point of delivery is often human, with an adult who loves children in their care in a small setting. Technology makes that a lot easier to happen now than it ever did before.
That's great. What I'd love to do is go down the line, maybe Joe, start with you and say a year from now, when we come back and have this conversation, what do we hope will have happened in the intervening year at this intersection of parent power and microschools, or a truly student-centered learning environment, regardless of where it is, to Lakisha's point, whether it's in the system or outside the system. So I'd love everyone share their thoughts on a year from now, and then hopefully we might have a couple minutes to open it up and see if there are questions from the audience, from the crowd here.
Sure. So I think a year from now, hopefully we have a number of states that are proof points for universal ESA that have been rolled out. So I think one of the biggest policy advances, specifically in the ESA and microgrant field, has been since Arizona passed universal ESA last year, the floodgates have kind of opened. So whereas that was seen, I think, even in Arizona as a long shot for a long time, now that's kind of considered table stakes. And so we have states like Utah and Iowa and Florida that are either creating a brand new ESA program or taking an existing one and expanding it. And each state is different and each law is different. And so what I hope in a year is that we're able to actually look and see that these programs have been implemented well, which means that there's limited fraud, that the programs are at or near capacity. And I think also, just to kind of the previous scale question, that the funds are flowing to high quality options, however the parent defines that, and allowing businesses and nonprofits and schools to thrive and grow on that. And so that's something that I'm very excited for, because I think across the country there have been ESAs to date, but I don't think we've kind of nailed implementation. Yep. So I'm really excited to be able to see that in the next year.
Lakisha.
For me, because I have floated to both ends, I'm going to say a couple things. So one, I'm going to highlight someone. So that's Sharon, who runs Colosso Academy in South Florida. I want to see more Colosso Academies where kids, especially some black kids, learn how to surf, right? Because we don't do water like that. So learn how to surf. And the reason why I think this is really important is because really wanting to see kids from our communities be exposed to a lot more. Yes, they're going to get their reading and math, but they need these experiences. When we built this virtual hub, the behaviors of self-reliance and agency with our families like 10x'd, okay? So I want to see more of that. On the flip side, because we have to swing to the other pendulum, we need more babies being able to read. We need more babies being able to do math because their trajectory may be different on the traditional side. But if we can get these kids at a younger age creating an identity around literacy and math that's strong, then later on they'll get to make those choices, right? So if their parents are not in a position to make those choices or they don't have parents to make a choice, if we can get that identity steeped that I'm good at math and I can read, they'll make those decisions for themselves later, and you best believe they'll be making those decisions for their children. So that's the trajectory I hope that we're on.
So a year from now, I think we're going to see a continuation of the dynamism that we've seen in the space so far. So we see no signs of this movement slowing down. In fact, we see it accelerating. So we're going to see more new starts. We're going to see more sector-based shifting of families who are trying new alternatives. I think that's all positive. At the same time, I think we're reality-based about some of the risks. So a year from now, looking forward, I would not be surprised at all as this level of dynamism increasingly threatens the status quo, that elevates the risk of regulatory capture. And so that's something that I'm very worried about. I know many of us in the room are worried about. How do we preserve the freedom of entrepreneurs to execute their craft? How do we preserve the freedom of families to pursue the solutions that work best for their kids?
I think there's a moment that happens with a parent or an educator where they recognize, like, I can be part of the solution. I think if you asked people, now versus next year, how happy are you with the overall options, or is everything great for your kid? I think those numbers are going to be the same. What I want is 10 times as many people in the category of, I can be part of the solution. I can create this. Having seen them do it, I'm so inspired by these people. And, I basically live for this. Each one is going to do exactly what we've been talking about today. They're going to open up in a way that sees kids, loves them, knows them at an individual basis. And let's help those people. Let's invite them to the party. I think this is going to be, it's going to need to be a lot bigger than this room. I think we need to be in a bigger room with lots more people that have done it,
Great.
I think quality matters, and I hope that in a year from now we can say that entrepreneurs everywhere delivered quality and quality implementation of big ESA programs, because I think that's the way to avoid regulatory capture, is to prove that you're 10 times better than the status quo and that it's irrefutable, and that parents just know that that's the case.
Adam, I do have to add, Meredith said something about the threats. Getting prepared for the threats now are important. Even though we have built a model inside the system, right now as we speak, our teachers union is trying to, they're doing a strike vote. And as we speak, we have launched a campaign and advocacy against that. So I just want to name that we have had to run advocacy alongside any solutions we built. So for anyone out there that's innovating, you will experience a threat. So you have to build up your advocacy skills. You have to teach your families that they are not going to you're going to have a lot of good days. You're going to have a lot of good days. But you're going to have some days like I have today where you have to get kind of gangster with some folks, okay? So when she said that, that kind of reminded me, like, build that now, and folks like us can really help with that. But you don't get a clear lane on this stuff. You just really don't.
You're going to add something too, Meredith? Okay, we've got inspiring stuff. There's obviously so much more to talk about. We've got a few minutes. I saw a hand right there. Maybe if you can grab a mic so folks can hear, or
just talk loud.
There you go.
Joseph, this is for you. How are parents finding these ESA and micro grants? How are they being connected to the state? And just maybe for anyone in the panel, as an ed tech company, what role do you see us in facilitating that connection?
Yeah, so I would say, because I used to be a practicing attorney, it depends, which is kind of a very lawyerly answer. I think some states have done it better than others. I think if you look at a state like Arizona, they passed universal last year. Since that time, it has, I think, 4.5x. They've been adding, I think, for the last couple of weeks, roughly 1,000 parents a week. In Idaho, we were fortunate to partner with a lot of nonprofit groups, African American advocacy groups, Hispanic advocacy groups, and actually have more demand for the Empowering Parents grant there than was actually available. And so I think a big part of this, I think to go back to what we were talking about before, is anyone building in this space, whether it's a micro school or a fund or an ESA administration company, there are elements where your business intersects with policy and with nonprofits. And I think it's very important to make sure that they're aware of these programs, because there is honestly an education component, right? We spend all of our time debating education policy. The average parent doesn't. And so there is outreach, I think, that's needed. And that's something I think that folks in the room can do.
Yeah, and I would just say, I think one of the things we've seen in some of the research we've done, we've talked to probably about 20,000 parents, demographically representative across the country over the last 18 months. And there's massive interest in this. Sort of awareness and accessibility are still real barriers. So I think, you know, in some of the ESA states that we've talked about that don't have a culture of choice and don't have a developed ecosystem, they're desperate for folks to come in and create opportunities and sort of an options for parents. And to Lakisha's point, like, there's also first level awareness. There are a lot of families and communities that just don't understand that these types of programs exist and that they present sort of alternative options for families. So I think, you know, thinking about how you can support the infrastructure that exists is a not immaterial opportunity, I think, for a lot of suppliers in the ecosystem. One last question here.
It's a question for Katelyn. So, you know, as an edtech founder, a majority of the venture firms I speak to are almost entirely focused on B2B models, edtech companies selling to the public education system. So you appear to have taken a different view. So two questions on that. When you look at companies, are you looking for a B2C plus a B2C, somewhat similar to what Lakisha was saying? And second, if you're looking at purely direct-to-consumer models, how is your investment thesis different from all the, you know, I guess, majority of other firms out there?
Well, I'd say we just look for founders that can win and win big. And Joe at Odyssey is one of our portfolio companies, and that's a solidly B2B model. So we invest B2B, B2C. We just want anything that can scale and win big. But, you know, I'd also say I have complete respect for every person in the arena that is building in this space, no matter how big or how small, B2C, B2B. Like, this is a tough industry, and a lot of people can win in so many different ways. And so we just look for founders that can really scale.
I want to take a moment to thank Katelyn, Kelly, Meredith, Lakisha, and Joe for a really great discussion. There's obviously a lot more to discuss. Please stay tuned, and hopefully we'll see you here next year. Thanks so much.